would say the stage is yours.
Okay.
Let's start.
Okay. So I talk a lot, so please interrupt if you want to. It'll mean we'll run over and there'll be less time for questions at the end, but I'd rather you talk when you want to interrupt. Right. Many years ago when I was in change management, I had a friend called Robin. And they took my secretary away and gave me a computer, and I had to keep my own diary. And I was hopeless. I could do work or I could do diary. I couldn't do both. And Robin was really good. He worked with me. But he was always checking my diary, and he was always saying, look, Jonathan, I'll go. He loved to go on the road. And he would be on the road, and he was always able to get himself upgraded. So I was in a 3-star hotel. He was in a 5-star hotel. And I would be flying second class, he'd be first class. And I said, Robin, how do you do this? He said, I'm a supply officer. I have means, you see. But he was always checking my diary. He'd say, Jonathan, okay. And one day he looked at my diary, he says, you've got an appointment for a northern university. I can't remember which one it was. And I said, I can't remember what that was, Robin, but I know it's important. He says, I'll go for you, don't worry. So off he went, and the morning that the meeting was on, he phoned me, he said, Jonathan, I've just had the best 5-star breakfast you can imagine. It was fantastic. And I said, oh, wonderful, Robin, but there's something about this meeting and I can't remember it. I said, I haven't put it in my diary. Said, don't worry, he said, I'll sort it out. About 10 minutes later, he said, I'm just on my way to the conference. Oh, guess what? 10 minutes later, he called me up. You bastard, he said. I said, excuse the language. I said, sorry? He said, you bastard. I said, what do you mean? He says, you're the keynote speaker. He says, I haven't prepared anything. I said, now's your chance to shine and show your full potential. I'll put the phone up. And I've laughed ever since. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is how we achieve our full potential. And there's a list of references for you, so I haven't always quoted the people, but if you come back to the references, please. I'm not trying to plagiarize anybody. So one of the things I've always been trying to do, cybernetics started off as the science of sciences, and it seems to have lost its way. And one of the things I've always tried to do is I read something. I read Leuven, or I read, I think, well, that's like this. Pask is saying the same as this. Here, he's saying this. So is there a commonality in systems? Has been always something that I've been looking for. Is there one thing that we can focus on? And at its heart, viability seems to me to be something that appears in every system. I see it in the latest work of the enactivist, Di Paolo, and people like this. They talk about a viability set. So I've stuck with the VSM because it was one of the first things I learned, and it's how I tend to see systems. And I've developed VSM, I find, not as a hard system, but as an epistemology for understanding viability. You have a past conversation with it, and it teases out what makes that system viable. The trouble I've had, and listening to Luke's conversation, this came up again and again. Suddenly, emotions appear. Where did they come from? Okay, because you can design a VSM, if you go back to Ross Ashby, you can design a VSM, Introduction to Cybernetics. He did it with little grids of tables with A, B, Cs and all that. You can design a VSM almost that is meaningless. So what I'm going to do is take you today through several key questions which I don't think are ever asked. Where is meaning in the VSM? Where is memory and learning in the VSM? And ultimately, what I want to do is to get to where is creativity in the VSM? And so how do we achieve our potential? And what I want to be able to do is to show you how I've used the VSM. If you don't interrupt too much, we'll get to look at how you can use the VSM to understand art. And so we can take it to much more esoteric areas than just business cybernetics. Right, a couple of things I wanted to say, and I'm going to people who are die-hard in the wool VSMers. There's going to be quite a lot of sort of questions asked about the failings of VSM. And one of them that I maintain is it's not a good forecasting model. It's really good for understanding a system. But you then try to predict what's going to happen. And if you look, and the question I have been asking you is, why is that? And if you look, it's because of this, no emotions. So one of the models that's doing the rounds at the moment, as you know, the great forecasting model, is Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's model, which is using Bayesian game theory. And Bayesian theory is really good for using incomplete information. So as a mariner, I used a lot of Bayesian theory in things like Markov chains and stuff like this. So Kalman filters, stuff like this. Okay, so how do we make this model better, VSM better? And the reason Bueno de Mesquita's model is doing so well is it involves power relations. It looks at the power relations in an organization and stuff like that, which become really important. And egotism, aggrandizement, and things like this, which seems to be what most decisions are made for. So we need to tackle its cybernetic origins. Right, so I'm going to use some different language because in expanding it, I've moved it out of management cybernetics. So system 1, probably the same, autonomy. System 2, I tend to use the words cohesion, harmony, and discord. Okay, system 3, coherence. Now, you'll find that some people switch these around. My father drives a train. He takes the train to London. From London, he picks up passengers and brings them back. Each of those sentences has cohesion, in that it links to the next sentence, and it also has coherence. The whole thing makes sense. My father drives a train. You can train a dog to bark. Bark grows on trees. Each of those sentences has cohesion, but it doesn't have coherence. Well, maybe it does to you, but it doesn't. Outside and then is anticipation and imagination. And policy is beliefs and ideals. So let's just look at knowledge. Now, there's a whole lot of ways you can look at knowledge. This is my way. There's tacit, there's implicit knowledge, there's knowing how, knowing what. I've simplified it with knowledge from experience on known to unknown, understanding or knowledge that's understood, understanding the system from understanding the system to not understanding it. And we try to live in this area where we have gained knowledge from our interaction between experience and understanding. And in Piaget's terms, we'd call it equilibration. We've achieved a balance or something. If we go along things that we know or things that we understand but have less and less experience of, if we use Piaget as a good example and the inactivists use the same, assimilation means we partially experience something, so we use mechanisms that we've already got to bring it into our understanding and our knowledge. If we go further along, we have not experienced something, but we gain pseudo-experience of it through language or through simulation or through play. Okay, and then there's the area where we don't actually experience anything. If we go up this way, where we experience something but we don't fully understand it, at first we try to accommodate that with new ideas, but further up we sort of start to develop theories. And if we move out where we don't necessarily have experience of something, we end up with our sense-making and our beliefs. And at the top left-hand corner, imagination, creativity, abstractions, pseudoscience, religions and faiths, and British politics. Okay, so you can go, yes. And so what we tend to be doing is trying to move stuff into this area. And what I wanted to show you is how we bring that down to here. Is that the right way? Wrong way? Right. Okay, there's some important distinction of the way we think. So how is meaning generated in the VSM? Okay. And I want to start by going right back to Spencer Brown. Can I just ask how many people are familiar with Spencer Brown? Right. Oh, good. Okay. So apologies then. I've made it a really simple explanation, but I was accused fairly recently of using magic in a conversation where I started quoting Spencer Brown in re-entry. And they're saying, you can't bring this in. So I just wanted people to know. The fundamental difference is Spencer Brown creates something from nothing. Now, I really struggled with that expression. But the broadcast model that we tend to do, where we draw networks and all this, If you lose the process that's connecting them, you end up with two separate systems. In Spencer Brown, if you lose the connection, you end up with one system. So it's fundamental difference in what we do. Now, Spencer Brown starts with a formless void. Now, if you go back to creation myths, the Bible starts with a formless void. And in fact, quite a lot of religions start with a formless void. And I had a lot of trouble with this, because how do you create something out of nothing? The Greek mythology doesn't. It starts with chaos. And Gaia came along and separated the heaven and the earth. Okay? So let me introduce you to chaos that you'll be familiar with. Okay? It's the kitchen drawer. Okay? You've all got a kitchen drawer like this, almost identical, because it's just chaos. You look at it and it's formless and voidless. And it's that way because it has to be. Because the other place where you put all your stuff, it's got the slot for the knives, you can separate it all out. But all these things have different purposes. So the only thing you can do is throw them all into a drawer. Yeah? So if you make a distinction, so Spencer Brown starts off by saying, you make a distinction. So let's say we decide there's wooden stuff on the left and everything else is chaos still. Okay? But I've separated out the wooden stuff. What Spencer Brown says is I need to make a mark. Okay? So I make a mark, I put a divider in there, and I'm going to put wooden stuff to the right there. Now, what Spencer Brown says is I've just made not only a distinction between wooden stuff and non-wooden stuff, or wooden stuff and chaos, I've entered into it here. This is where I need, I can't remember the name, the presentation view. Okay. Now, sorry, I have to see my notes. Once we've cleaved a space and made our mark, Spencer Brown brings up an important point in that we're seeing this as a second-order observer. Imagine you're an ant crawling along there and you crawl over the divider and you're now in wooden spoons. All you see is wooden spoons, okay? And so you're in the world of wooden spoons. Now, the trouble is, you've just made another distinction between the divider and the wooden spoons. So Ranulph, Glanville and Varela said, actually, you've got to put another divider in there. And he said, hang on a minute, you've got to put another divider in between that divider and the other divider. And that goes on, and he actually causes a recursion. So the wooden spoons disappear. Now, before it does your head in, there's just one key point you want to take about that, is that when you're down in flatland in the system, if you see the distinction, you can't see the value of the distinction. That gets hidden. And it's a little bit like saying, I can see what you're doing, I can't see why you're doing it. And this gets important for meaning in the end. Ranulph Glanville goes into saying you actually got to mark it with a Mobius strip, which looks like a mark, but doesn't have an inside and an outside. Now hold on to your seats a second, because this gets fun. Okay, so I hope you're all happy with this. If I'm A, okay, I see. How do I see myself? Well, the only way I can distinguish myself is to have a distinction of not self. And that not self might be another. But not another as a self, another as a not self. Okay? Sorry. Okay? So I can only see that distinction. But B is a self as well. And he can see himself as a self if and only if he can make a distinction of everything else that's not self. So he's crossed the drawer into wooden spoons. I'm a wooden spoon, and those are not wooden spoons. But for A to see B as an other self, as another person, you need to be looking at the distinction. You need to create a C. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, in sailors, I could use several sailor languages to explain that. Sounds like utter rubbish, okay? But it's not. That is actually autism. It's when you can't make that second. We have a mechanism in our brains, which is in the right hemisphere, which automatically allows us to be second-order observers. And it causes an awful lot of confusion in our rational thinking. We automatically leap to make ourselves a second-order observer of the distinctions that are being made. And there's another disease called autopagnosia. where somebody will quite happily work, move anything, but if you say, where's your arm, he'll say, I don't know. Because actually, to identify your arm, you're seeing your arm as another self, as another, and you can't do that. So actually, it's not rubbish. It's actually seriously, it actually happens in our brains. And there's only a few animals that have this ability to see another self as a self. Dolphins, monkeys, crows, I think there's a few. Now, Rita Carter tells a really interesting story, Mapping the Mind, which is a wonderful book. It's a bit old now. But she talks about a young boy who's autistic, and his father gets annoyed with him always helping himself to biscuits. So he tells him if he wants a biscuit, he's got to point at the biscuit barrel. And this makes this whole point about autism, and not being able to see the self of the other. Because the father's walking past the kitchen one day, and he sees the boy standing in the kitchen all on his own, pointing at the biscuit barrel. And he keeps pointing, and he's getting more and more angry, because he doesn't understand that there needs to be another self, who's a self, to give him a biscuit. So let's just do re-entry. I can go off that now. And this comes important to where creativity is later. And again, if you read Leuven, am I saying that right? Leuven? Leuven. Okay, if I was in Leuven, he keeps talking. Leuven, he keeps talking about re-entry, and after a while, again, you lose your mind. So again, apologies to all those who really know Leuven, but let me just explain it to you in terms of me and my wife going to buy her a hat. Okay, so we walk down the street and we make a distinction to start with between the hat shop and other shops. Now, one of the key points is we're already in paradox, okay, because a distinction is a distinction. Okay, so it's a bit like saying, how do I make if I ask everyone what a decision is, and eventually I say to you, are we trying to decide what a decision is? We're already in a circularity. And so a distinction is a distinction because you could be having a non-distinction or some other, a guess or something like that. So anyway, we walk into the shop and she's given a choice of 3 hats, tall, pointy hats, round hats or square hats. So she chooses a tall, pointy hat. Okay. So they take us into another room with tall, pointy hats. Okay. And she's going to choose a really tall, pointy one or a flatter one or whatever. But the meaning of that decision that she first made has to come with us, okay? It has to make a re-entry. So it doesn't mean anything unless it has another or non-other as its sense of meaning. So what I'm trying to do is to get to where meaning is, okay? So meaning, and then when we go, so he chooses a pointy hat, we go to choose different colours. So we go into another room, and she has to take that decision, and the one in the middle, and the fact that we're making a distinction with us. So re-entry happens again and again. Now, it's about this point I lose my sense of mind, because my wife says I've only got 3 emotions, sad, happy, and hungry. And she says hungry is related to sad and happy. So I normally say something, I normally have got low blood sugar levels by now, and I say something like, let's go to another shop if these hats aren't any good, are they? And, and then I think, why did I say that? We could have gone for a meal. But, so then we go to another hot shop. And what we do is we end up in a recursion, going round and round, and a paradox. And we'll see that. So where are the distinctions in the VSM? So let's start, and where is meaning generated in the VSM? Let's start with just categorizing the variety in the environment. Who does that? Who categorizes the variety? So Stafford draws this little diagram, and he's drawn it all. And one of the problems we have when we do the VSM, we automatically become an outside observer looking at that system. And one of the points I want to try to get to, actually when you're using the VSM in management, you're inside the system. And it's not that easy to be a second-order observer. You're the ant crawling through the dividers. If system 1, the operator, who actually takes the action, says this one, is the one making the decision. Now, going back, when you made that distinction, Spencer Brown brought in something really important. He said there has to be an observer with a motive who makes that distinction. He's brought the observer into the decision of what's happened. Now, if it's system 1 who has the value of that decision, Okay. What's system 1's metasystem doing? And I'm talking about the lower metasystem in the system here. Because remember, the system 1 can see the distinction that the operating system is making, but it can't see why. And this is one of the reasons I really have problems with top-down design, is the top part of management can see what the system's doing, but it can't understand why. Okay, so it can't see the value of that distinction. Now let's look at all. So Stafford does this. He magically brings meaning into the VSM with transduction, this third law, third principle. And these are all the points where he says it. Could you just bring up the thing for me? Now he says something interesting. He says, and I don't know where, someone might be able to help me, where Stafford got transduction from. Did it come from Ross Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics, or did it come, which it sounds more like, and Ross Ashby, I think, probably got it from Sharon and Weaver and their model of communications. So something's being transmitted, it goes through a channel, because Stafford talks a lot about channel capacity and all of this sort of thing. Now, that doesn't match with what Spencer Brown's saying, or I can't make it match. On the one hand, we've got the variety in the environment transmitting to the system, and the other, we've got the system making up its mind about the distinction. Now, it doesn't really matter if you're just trying to tease out the meaning in the system. They're both sort of producing meaning. But what I worry about is how meaning magically appears in the VSM. And we magically assign it. And we automatically forget about the second order observers. So all these little dots where information's being turned into the language. So what he does, it codes the message into the receiver sender's language. How does it do that then? How does the environment code something into your language? And this is one of the problems I have with the VSM. I don't think it can. I think it's a useful metaphor, but I don't think it does it. I prefer going back to Spencer Brown, saying the system is making a distinction in the environment. Okay. Now, the other problem we've got is if we accept Spencer Brown, then we've got a big problem. Because all the way up through, this system is making a distinction, but the little systems in here are making distinctions. And this whole system here is making a distinction. And those values are different. And that's the problem of management. You've got all through the system, you've got values. And anyone who's worked in a big organization will know that. You know, when the management lock themselves in a room and they come out with a mission statement, and it starts off with a world class, and all the workers go, what planet are they on then? You know, we're a little company that produces chocolate eggs. You get people saying, what, you know, why are they doing that? And the reason is you're getting those values. So the problem of management, I'll show you. Remember, it can't see that the top level metasystem there, in my understanding, can't see the values that are being used to make the distinctions all the way down through the system. So they've got to communicate those values that they believe are important. And I'll talk about leadership later on, because I believe in a thing called followship. There go my people, I must follow them because I am their leader. I think I've covered that, haven't we? Yes. The lower level sees the value, but it has a blind spot. It can't see the not the values. Yeah, okay. I think that covers that. I'll have to. Oh, wrong. No. Oh, right. So Luke, very interestingly, brought up quite a lot of stuff, and suddenly we leapt into emotions. We had a fear of this. We had anxiety about that. Where did that come from, Luke? Where was it? Because remember, I can construct this system with ABCs. There's no emotion in there. But emotion, it's turning out, is absolutely vital to our decision making. If you damage emotional centers, the dorsal, lateral, prefrontal cortex and places like this, people can't make decisions, the emotional centers. We use emotions as a heuristic, and there's not a lot of science that's gone on about emotions. And there's quite a few opposing forces. One is about appraisal, and one is about arousal. So one is that we mentally decide what emotions we're going to trigger, and the other is arousal, that our body gets adrenaline pumped into it, and then our brain says fear. Colombetti and the enactivists bring that whole lot together as a complex understanding of how a system does it. And the reason I've brought up meaning is because meaning, Colombetti ties meaning to emotions. So if we can understand the meaning in a VSM, we can start to bring emotions into that VSM. Oh, why has it done that? Why am I going along the bottom? Can I have the screen up again? Sorry. I always remember Paul Stokes did one of these lectures, and he held the thing upside down and the slides were going backwards. Right. Becker. This is Becker, I think. So that re-entry thing is quite useful for looking at these layers of recursion that are going on in a VSM. So re-entry occurs and the repeated recursions throughout the system, generating meaning as it goes. The system 3 coherence brings that all together. So whether or not system 3 actually does cohere everything, it's a useful metaphor to say this all happens at this point. And so Becker shows, this is the symbol that's used for re-entry. So Becker shows a product is inside the wooden spoons and the technology is outside. And, but the technology makes a re-entry to make the product. We take that meaning with us. Okay? And that process is work. And though he uses this very useful little model to go down through how a firm works, to show how important the levels of recursion generate meaning. But this is what I want to show you really. Any organization has its own history, which is known only to itself, and is only partially known to itself. The history of the organization is embodied in its procedures, its statutes, its written and unwritten rules, its technology, its buildings, its mission, ideals and ideology, its people, its knowledge, its management, its markets and its networks. And what he's basically saying is that meaning of the system is embedded within the meaning of the system, is embedded in the meaning of the system. And I'll show you how I don't like models. So when we get to system 4, this idea that people have got a model of the system. You know, if I ask you to imagine a tree, you get a brief glimpse of a tree, and then you have to try and put it together. And that's because your brain reconstructs, it doesn't remember. So the fact that we reconstruct things for systems 4, when we try to work out what's going on in a firm, we get bits of it together. Oh, no, I'm going the wrong way. No. Oh no, we've done that one, haven't we? Okay, autopoiesis. So where's autopoiesis in the VSM? The VSM is an input-output model, essentially. You can have you can look at a system in two ways. It's autopoiesis, its method of self-production, or it's input-output processes. Now, Stafford basically was looking at management, so he's looking really at the input-output process. But he starts using words like pathological autopoiesis. So he clearly believed there was autopoiesis in there. Now, the problem comes with what Manturano Varela said in the definition of autopoiesis, that autopoiesis had to have a topological domain. It had to be. Now, I don't have a problem with that because you look at the VSM, which has, say, got a factory in it. That's allopoietic. That's not autopoietic. The factory makes things. But it depends where you draw that topological boundary. If I include the people who make the factory or repair the factory, now everyone says, oh, no, you can't do that. But if you take a cell that Manturano, not every bit of the cell makes itself, other bits make other bits. And it's where you've put the boundary around it that the system gets described as autopoietic. Now, Mingers wrote pages of this, and I've got a whole book, Self-Producing Systems and so on. I think it's a red herring because the inactivists, and we'll come to see them, have actually gone into autopoiesis and found the faults. And the couple of faults are time, precariousness. The autopoiesis can run forwards or it can run backwards. Real life can't. Okay? But also adaptivity and precariousness. To get rid of the time problem, you add in precariousness. The bits can die in the system and fail. And so it can't run backwards. And that's what the inactivists did. The second problem is the sugar gradient that Mantarella talked about, saying the bacteria will go up the sugar gradient. Well, it can't. It only knows, autopoiesis only knows yes or no, really. It doesn't have a value-making system in it. So the problem you've got, so when the inactivists brought in difference in value, you have to bring in a whole adaptivity process. And that then allows you to start to move on with autopoiesis. Right, quick question. Where is memory and learning in the VSM? How does the VSM learn? Okay, now, Hermes Stats. Most people who've only learnt the VSM and haven't read Ross Ashby or Design for a Brain will really only understand it as a system that attenuates or amplifies variety. But it's not. It's a self-organizing set of systems. And the way it does it is when it gets thrown outside its threshold, a homeostat starts searching for another balance point with the other homeostats. Now, I just did this simply because I couldn't find, I think there's a paper on it somewhere, but I've never found it. But this is a system of 10 homeostats, each with only 3 states. And this is the combination that it has to go through to find the total number of combinations, not permutations, which but with 10 systems with only 3, you've got 4,000 options to go through. Now, in living systems which have a fifth of a second reaction time, that's 15 minutes to come to a solution. Now, I'll go back. So I don't think homeostats work. Not only that, where is... psychologists would say the most simple form of learning is sensitization, satiation, and the other one, habituation. Most organisms have an ability to know when they're full. And if you didn't have that, what would happen is you'd constantly be eating. As soon as your sugar levels went down, you'd be like me. You'd say, well, I'm going to go get something else to eat. Okay. Most sensible people actually wait a bit, and then they come up again. If the homeostat that Ross Ashby gave used negative feedback to maintain itself between the states, so you'd constantly be eating. Where have we gone? Have we gone backwards again? Sorry, pressing buttons. Here we go. This is from Di Paolo. Natural cognitive systems do not build pictures. So I missed saying that a lot of people would say System 4 is where the memory is. That's where the model is by Stafford. Yes? No? So natural cognitive systems do not build pictures of the world. They engage in the generation of meaning in what matters to them according to the logic laid by their self-sustaining identity. They enact a world. The notion of sense-making grounds in biological organization a relational and affective-laden process. And you can read the rest. The inactivists have really got to the bottom, but they haven't yet, in my opinion, started to solve the higher levels of social. We've got some areas. Would you agree with that, Ivor? They've looked really at the lower structure. They haven't started really to look at the top structure. And one of the problems I have with them is multiple identities and stuff like this. They haven't tackled those problems. But what I'm trying to say here is that System 4 can't make a model. Even if we use collective memory of a group of people, then let's go to Carl Wick and his transitive memory. And what Carl Wick says is that if we as a group start to form, then you start to remember one bit. You get known as the techie guy, and we leave all that to you. And we combine our resources to do all of that. So again, when we have to solve a big problem, we have to construct it somehow. We don't have a model. It's not easy. Okay, Leuven. I have real trouble with Piaget. Okay, where is communication in the VSM? Okay, now I like this little useful thing because Leuven really blew Sharon and Weaver out the water in many ways by saying that the recipient, it's not just about the information. There's the announcement and the understanding. And the understanding belongs in the recipient. And so let me just give you a good example. You hear a conversation between two people. You can only partially see it, but one person says, I really want to play football. And that's the information. So the information that is, this guy wants to play football. But if I add in the announcement, the way it was said, it was quite angry. Okay? So I really want to play football. Well, that would mean that he really, really wants to play football. But hang on a minute, let's include the previous conversation. And the previous conversation, he's sitting there with a leg in plaster. And so he's being sarcastic. And so actually he's saying he doesn't want to play football. Yeah, I really want to play football. I've got a broken leg. You know, and then there's silence. What happens if someone answers the question by not saying anything? The information, I've never quite understood, someone might be able to help me, where the information is in that, in Sharon and Weaver. But in Leuven, it's no problem. That in itself is a distinction. I won't go into all of Leuven. I talked to Leidesstoff the other day, and he said, I've studied Leuven for 30 years, and I consider I've wasted my life. But some of the things are really useful for bringing in. Double contingency. Now, the thing here where you've got conversations going, and this is the best example I can give of this, is Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty standing at the waterfall. And they're both anticipating what the other's going to do, until Sherlock Holmes thinks, the only way I can beat this is throw us both off the river, both off into the river. And so this is double contingency, is I know what he knows, And what's important about that is that expectation structure when we have a conversation. And this is where I start to think, well, hang on, this sounds awfully like Pasque conversational theory to me. But for Leuven, that's the topic of the conversation. That's the structure-determined part of that, which is really useful. Hermeneutics, I'll leave it, is acceptance of rejection. There's that bit up there. And then I'll put up there Pasque's conversation theory, which to me starts to bring all this together. When I was at sea and in command, rather than just issue dictates and orders, I used to use a thing called the theory of the thread, where you teased out a conversation. And funnily enough, I sort of think this is from Carl Wick in Sense Making for Organisations, and he quotes somebody else doing it. And it's a little girl who is asked to say what is she going to say, and she says, how will I know what I mean until I see what I said? And the key point about that, and with the reference to the VSM, is we have a conversation with the VSM. Past conversation. I really like this, and I forget, Ivo sent it to me, and it was really useful. Was it? Oh, that's right. Paul, yes, Paul, that's it. And he's saying, actually, replace one of the participants with your own notes. You're having a conversation with as you look at your notes, you think, that's what I meant, or I could have meant that. And you're teasing out the meaning. Now, if we bring the VSM is very cut and dried with meaning. When you start to add in this to the VSM, we start to get much more nuances of how we have to use it to tease out what we mean. I've already covered this, so I won't... that's me nearly done, actually, isn't it? Right. Adaptivity comes through the addition of a variable motive. And if we allow precariousness into it... Now, precariousness is the ability of a system to die fairly quickly. More precariousness. And that comes from Hans Jonas, which is really useful. What Hans Jonas says is the more degrees of freedom a system gets, the more precarious it becomes.
Need for freedom.
Sorry, degrees of...
Because needful freedom.
Yes, sorry, a big fault, yes. Yeah, thank you. Actually, sorry, come and do that. Ivo and I talk a lot, so it's... Yeah. I think we have very similar ideas, Ivo and I. Agency, I haven't really talked about. Inactivists bring in structural coupling, but they say when it becomes asymmetric, when I can control more the other system than the other system can be, we can develop a concept of agency. Now, some of the low-level stuff that these inactivists are doing, I think, answers a lot of questions as to how you can do it, how the VSM do. Right. Now, Di Paolo brings up an important point. He says that sometimes to change, a system has to go through non-viability. It has to become almost unviable to make a transition through. And what he's basically saying, so I'll come to the next question, which is where is creativity? And I'll give a good example of this. Is my brother, it's a true example. My brother, like all Huxleys, he's pedantic and pain in the neck. So he was sat in a meeting where his big boss came down, and his big boss was telling him, think outside the box. Okay? Think outside the box. We need you all to think outside the box more. Yes, Timothy Huxley. He says, how do we do that then? He says, well, box inside, I want you to think outside it. Still not with you. Innovate. He says, can you help us a bit more? Be creative. Okay. Still struggling here. And he says, if you don't start thinking of new ideas, you're going to be fired. Right, gotcha. Okay. And that true conversation is demonstrates that most organisations prefer stability over creativity, and that creativity causes great unrest in an organisation. Okay. So why do we need it? So Entology, Stafford actually recognised this, and he just called this. Anyone know what he called this? Test quiz.
Potential futures?
Start of a 10? No. So it's actually very interesting. I do a quiz on the VSM. It's quite interesting because in his drawing he only does three lines and asks what are they. The first two here he's actually talking about trends. Trends. This one he calls novelty. Be creative. So, but all he says is, like the boss, be creative. Excuse me, Stafford. How do we do that then? Okay. Now, so this is, we leave rational thinking now and we come into my thinking, okay? One of the things that I've noticed is creativity comes from that recursion, true creativity. So we've got assimilation where something happens and I've always bashed it with a hammer, so if this new thing works when I bash it with a hammer, I've assimilated that into my schema. We've got accommodation where basically, and this is where the Hermes Stat works quite well, is I've got to solve this problem. Bashing it with a hammer doesn't work. I can't assimilate it. So I try a variety of things that are within my domain, the green line. And I randomly select them. So we used to have a shop in England called Innovate. And I used to think, you walked in there, and all they did was think of two different ideas and put them together. So you had a torch and an umbrella. So let's create a torch umbrella. And that's a little bit like accommodation. And that's what the Hermes Stat does. It actually does solve problems. But I argue, and there's no proof, that you can't solve a problem outside the domain of your own thinking. So how do you solve a problem outside your own domain? And you need to, because you're trapped in the logic of circularity in your own system, in your own autopoietic system. It keeps making the same decisions around again. How do you come out of that? And what seems to happen in all processes, and we as humans, this is the thing I was interested to talk about, Peter, we seem to recognise, we not only recognise creativity, we really value it. We pay to go to a cinema to watch creativity, and we pay art people a lot of money. What happens, going back to there, is at some point we get closer and closer and closer to an answer, but we can't touch it. But we see in another domain a resonance of some sort that we recognize. There's a resonance that we recognize as being the answer. And we bring that domain back into our system with a re-entry. And it expands our current system. Now, where do we use that? So, Bateson recognized it with the pattern that connects. That was one of his key phrases. Okay. Abduction with Pearson. The role of chance in the Hermes Stat and natural drift. Now, in mathematics, and the trouble is that whenever we explain this system, we always use mathematics, and that switches everybody off. So the golden number 5, we take the Fibonacci series and we take the ratio of the numbers. We get closer and closer to a number, but nobody knows what that number is. Until we go outside into another domain and say, sod it, we'll call it phi. And then we bring that back into the domain of real numbers and start using it as a number. Okay. I'm not too keen on this, but Hegel's concepts of triadic development are close to that. I liked Garanjandi. Anyone work with him here? No, not remember. But he talks about, he does several papers. He was a student of Akhoff. Past conversation theory is a little bit like that. You go round and round and suddenly someone has an idea, ping. But it's in all our literature, and this is where we make the switch to why art is so important. Art suddenly becomes really, really important as a means of teasing out understanding, both in narrative, the way we create a narrative. So this is not liked by the academics, but it's a useful explanation. The trouble is, Joseph Campbell went too far and said everything is a hero's journey. Does everyone know Joseph Campbell? So here we go. Here's the same pattern again, the hero's journey. In his book, Every Hero Has 1,000 Faces. And it's basically copied. If you go to several websites that do creative writing, you find that they're more sophisticated now, but there's still this pattern. Somebody's living in a paradox. Goes round and round. He can't see his way out of the box. And something happens that forces him into another domain, which is normally magical of some sort. Okay? He goes into another domain, and then he has a moment of recognition of something else. And then he brings that back in. And that covers most of our stories. Now, I won't cover this, but what I've done is to take those ideas and redraw the VSM and what I do is like to embed the VSM back in its environment. Stafford took it out, and I think that's a mistake. I want to see the VSM in an environment because it's part of its environment. That's a whole nother lecture, and I won't go into it. But I started off by creating in Python a little things in the swamp, I call them, and trying to create a little bit of life. Interestingly, Randall Beer has said recently that game of life is autopoietic, follows the rules of autopoiesis. That's quite interesting. And this is how I'd use it to study art. So what I would do is, looking at the environment and the context of the time, art would have three things. It would have an artist, an object, and observers. And what's really interesting with the observers is they change over time. So how does art keep its value over time? It's interesting. And these systems, this is the management system of these. For me, the meta system, and going back to Leuven's, I had trouble with Leuven, that communications create communications, until I realized that communications are basically organizing. And I have no trouble, having worked in the Ministry of Defense, to say that organizing organizes organizing. Because that's all we ever did, is send. And if you want to know how much organizing you're doing, look at how many emails you're sending. Okay? And we seem to send, in government, an awful lot of organizing emails. And we organize and organize and organize. So Leuven was absolutely right. There is no problem. Communications create communications. And we see them in all of things. So these are how you're organizing your ideas. But what's actually happening is happening in the phenomenal world. So lastly, I'll just look at her. So do many know the history of Mona Lisa? So if we look at the artist to start with, Leonardo wasn't doing portraits at this time. He had left Milan and gone to Florence, and he was living in an abbey or monks thing. And yet he took on this commission. Okay? So if we analyse it, he took on this commission, and she was a rich merchant's wife. And normally, she would be shown in all her finery. And she's not. And not only that, there would be a very distinct background which would have some sort of other meaning. There's a tension. So one of the things I showed at the beginning, harmony. System 2 shows harmony and discord. And art is really good at teasing out the tension in that. He's drawn an imaginary background in. And not only that, he's drawn the background in so it flows into her. And it brings her to the forefront. And it fades into the background. He's practiced these hands before, but he spent almost a year studying cadavers in the morgue and looking at the smile and how it worked. And he developed 2 new methods of, I won't attempt Italian and say what they are, 2 new methods of actually developing painting, which just put layer upon layer upon layer to make her glow. And okay, can you say them? Can you? Sfumato and so on. What was he trying to say with this picture? And it was revolutionary at the time. And what he's trying to say is, this is what it's to be alive. One of the things he does is the background doesn't follow here. So when you look at it, your eyes make a switch and she moves. You don't realize it. This is the work of a genius, and it's his ultimate work, to try and draw somebody as if they're alive. This is what it's to be alive. And he's showing her smile because, and it's interesting this, Leonardo was gay and he had his lover with him and he had music played and he had food and it was all a big show. And what's really wonderful is she's smiling at all of this going on and you can't see it. She's the second order observer of what's happening. Okay, that's it. I'll leave her up.